So our next speaker is Professor Michael Anderson. You might not believe this, Michael, but I was in awe of you for many years. This is a very distinguished economic historian who has written a whole lot of stuff, and the best I know of is the population stuff on Scottish population history. But he was also flew through various ranks at the University of Edinburgh, ending up near the top of the University of Edinburgh. But subsequent to his retirement, he's continued to carry on research and done some wonderful stuff on population history, and particularly the period after 1860. I don't know if any of you have seen his monumental book on that subject, which came out 3 or 4 years ago. And it, like one of the books we talked about yesterday, came so close to winning the prize for the Saltire Society's Scottish History Book of the Year, but not quite, but very close, Michael. Yeah. Anyway, we look forward to hearing what you've got to say today about Scotland's population history, particularly in relation to the islands and large and small. So, thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you. Right. Well, hello, and I come to this topic from a completely different direction, I suspect, to more or less anybody else who's speaking today. I got interested in Scotland's population history, and originally how Scotland fitted into the rest of the UK and Ireland and Europe. And then, the more I looked at it, the more it became clear that there wasn't a Scotland. There are multiple Scotlands, and in fact, the book that Chris just referred to is called Scotland's Population Histories, and it deliberately seeks to actually show the diversities and to link those diversities to economic, social, cultural, and indeed even to some extent topographical phenomena. And islands, if you're working down to these small levels, islands are very useful because their boundaries don't change. Parishes, which are wonderful for lots of purposes, we've got data going over long periods of time, the only trouble is the boundaries change. Islands, broadly speaking, are the same. So you've got the same space into which different numbers of people do different things over time. That's how I got into it. So anyway, so what for my purposes is an island? An island is a piece of land on which at least one person has been recorded at any time since 1841. And up until actually 1861, there are quite a lot of small islands which get combined with big ones. So in fact, a lot of what I'll talk about today is the post-1861 islands, which also fits anyway with my wider knowledge. And the other feature is it's completely surrounded by salt water for at least part of every day. So you'll be pleased to know Skye is an island. As also is, for example, Oronsay next to Colonsay, even though you can splash across at low tide. South Ronaldsay is an island because there's a causeway. And having taken that definition, then some places which have lighthouses on are also islands, even if they're actually quite small. So in 1841, since 1841, there have been about 230 islands populated at least one census, and populated there up until 1981, we have the number of people who were recorded living in on a place on census day. Since then, it's the number of residents. But I'm not bothered about that distinction today, but that's quite important for some examples. More than 230 islands populated. Today, of the surviving islands, 87, they make up about 2% of Scotland's population. Compare 5.4% of Scotland's population in 1861 on at least 184 islands. Now this highly misleading graph is total island populations. And as you can see over here on the left-hand side, we get a rise up to 1841. That's probably actually a slight exaggeration. Then we get the potato failure, and it falls. And then really, right the way through until particularly 1911, we have it, things look pretty flat. 1921 is odd. It dumps because the census was held in June, when lots of people were on holiday. Lots of people from the mainland were on holiday, so we'll see this happening in a number of places, and sometimes it's very interesting. But the critical thing really is that after the First World War, island populations crash. And oh, island population.
Middle button there.
All right, yes. Oh, yeah. Button there. Doesn't matter. It will manage. Islands population crash. And then, in aggregate, they broadly speaking flatten out. And that, I think, is actually really quite interesting. People talk a lot about island depopulations. If you look at the whole lot, actually, since 1951, certainly since 1971, there's not actually been that much to change. But of course, there is huge variation in populated islands by physical size. And it's easy to forget just how small many of the populated islands are. I mean, over on the left-hand side, over here, we have 6 islands which are more than 500 square kilometers. On the right-hand side, we have almost 100 islands which are less than 1 square kilometre. And for those of you who like old money, that's about half a mile by 3/4 of a mile. Small. Some of them, of course, much, much smaller even than that. And so you had this huge proportion of total islands which are actually under 5 square kilometres. In fact, over 70% of the populated islands over time have been tiny. But of course, much more crucial to us than variations in size, variations in population. Now, this slightly complicated graph actually is really very simple. The top line, the blue one, looks at islands which in 1861 had populations of more than 15,000. And you can see from the little number up there, there were 4 of them. And broadly speaking, they look pretty flat over the 19th century. They go down after the First World War, right the way through to 1971. And then these 4 big islands, Shetland mainland, Orkney mainland, Lewis and Harris counted as 1 island, and Skye, that's what happens to them. The next ones, the red line, populations 5 to 15,000, and this is the 1921 census effect, because in there we have got Bute and we have got Arran, and they were, as we shall see, big, big holiday islands. Broadly speaking, those islands change over time, and over time they fall by about 4%. So fall by about 1/6. The grey line, the next one, that's islands between 1,000 and 5,000 in 1861. There were 13 of them. All of them are still populated in 2011, but they've fallen by about half. And as we come then, and as Chris said earlier, the smaller the island, on average, the bigger the problem. 100 to 1,000. The orange line start off with 45, end up with 39. 6 of even of those have become depopulated. And the final one, this is the islands, 118 of them, with less than 100 people in 1861. By 2011, only 27 are still populated. If I'd cut it off, by the way, at 20, I would have started with 80 and ended up with 5. 20 is very, very crucial. If an island gets below 20, then there's a very high probability that it will not survive for another 20 years, and that goes on again and again and again over time. However, there are obviously lots of different islands in different sorts of ways, and how and why, therefore, do the things actually change? And above all, the key point is to try and think about this sort of thing in terms of what I've called population potentials. And population potentials are things that encourage or discourage people to stay on an island, go to an island, leave an island, and they are different at different times. So, for example, slate was a huge boom in the 19th century for 1 or 2 islands, and, as we shall see later, virtually disappears. Salt fish sustained, salt and cured fish sustained island populations until the big market for it, Russia, stopped buying it after the revolution. And islands managed perfectly all right without electricity, or rather they thought they did, when there wasn't electricity generally. But over time, the absence of electricity becomes a major factor as well. So, what I'm going to try and look at in the next section is what some of those population potentials are. And the first one is location and distance to start with. And notice that I've said distance from the mainland or distance from a big island. And this is very important, I think, because actually, by the time you get to the big islands like Orkney and Shetland and Skye and Lewis, a huge proportion of the things that people look for can be provided somewhere on the island. And that's why I'm not the slightest bit interested in how far Shetland is from the mainland. It's something that people always talk about. I'm not interested in that, because actually Shetland is its own almost self-contained island. Self-contained community. Now this map actually, however, points out that while there are some islands, and actually it misses one of the closest, no, there it is, just shown the Cumbraes, very close. And obviously the tidal islands like the Oronsay and Ornsays, but some of them are very different. Right out on the left there, St Kilda. St Kilda, 45 kilometres to the west of Uist. Over here, to the left of just above where it says Benbecula, is the Monarch Islands. And then North Rona, it actually says Rona there, it means North Rona. That has hardly been populated since 1841, but there are people who believe that two men lived on it for a short period of time. But interestingly, distance isn't everything. Fair Isle, halfway between Shetland and Orkney, and Fula, I'll talk more about both of them later, are good surviving island communities, at least at the moment. And in some ways, therefore, accessibility is more important than distance. And accessibilities, well, we've talked already about low tide crossings, causeways, the causeway around Scapa Flow, for example, or the causeway between Barra and Watersee, which actually saved Watersee as an island. And then bridges, don't need to talk about bridges here. And then piers, jetties, harbours. One of the great things about both Fairal and Fula is you can take boats in. Fula even has an airstrip. But it doesn't always work. Stroma in the Pentland Firth between Orkney and Caithness had a wonderful harbour built, and the people were paid to build it. And then, guess what? They all, virtually all, decided to use the money and move to the mainland. And the island, in fact, subsequently became depopulated. And ferries, Great Cumbrae, an 8-minute ferry, Kerrera, an easy commute across for some people who go to Oban. Even Bute has weekend commuters, and indeed a few people who go across to the mainland every day. But how about that? 3 working ferries in Oban Harbour. It's 2011. And what you've got here is you've got the Isle of Mull in the middle, going off to Craignure, 45 minutes. Lots of people commute 45 minutes. Indeed, it's becoming increasingly popular, according to yesterday's newspapers. The Lord of the Isles, sitting there over on the left, off to Tyree and Col, 4 to 5 hours by the time we've done it. And the Isle of Lewis just coming in from Castle Bay, well, that's at least 5 hours. That's a very different business. But notice also that it isn't just the length of the journey, it's also where you get landed. One of the fascinating things is Islay, which is actually not done nearly as well as you would expect. It's a 2-hour ferry journey, and it lands you in the middle of nowhere, really. And actually, people come from Islay, and they get off at Kennacraig, and then to get to the nearest big supermarket, they go to Oban. And so actually, what happens at the terminal itself matters. So that's distance and accessibility. Crucial, but not entirely all the story. How about topography? Topography. That shows you hills and mountains. Obviously, very variable. There are some islands like Arran, and that's Handa up there. Sorry, not Handa. It's Hoy up the top there on Orkney, and large areas of, for example, Mull, and of course Skye, very mountainous islands. Now, mountains work 2 ways. They're very attractive to tourists. I don't need to tell anybody here about that. But equally, over time, people have less and less wanted to live higher up islands, and indeed to competitively farm higher up islands. And actually also, you can keep sheep up an island nowadays, and up a mountain nowadays, at least in the lower reaches. And in the past, they always had to have shepherds. And now, you don't need, in general, to have shepherds, at least living up there. They can drive by car if they want to go. So topography, interesting, and explains why some of our islands are so relatively unpopulated compared, for example, with the Azores, where I'm off to in 2 weeks' time, where the populations of the same size islands are anything up to 10 times what they are the Scottish islands. Our agricultural potential. Well, that's Barvas Moor. Not much goes on out there now, and indeed it was always only summer pasture largely, and along with it, lazy beds. That's an agriculture which supported people, but becomes decreasingly competitive over time. And indeed, it's a huge amount of work. And indeed, even macha, very pretty, but actually not particularly good yield arable. That actually deals with most of the outer islands. Contrast, yes, we do have some really good quality arable on our islands. That's Skye, off the Mull of Kintyre. Though actually, by modern competitive standards, those are rather small fields. And so even there, and it's very exposed, it's not entirely as good as it might be, but how about that? And that's Butte. And actually, the interesting thing, of course, about Butte is Butte strong on mixed agriculture and particularly on dairying, as of course also was Orkney. Orkney completely different from most of the other northern and western isles for that reason. And in fact, this map is the proportion of land under arable and mixed cultivation for parishes in 2007. And you can see actually that there is relatively little when you do it at this scale. Anyway, the yellow is under 10% of land area under arable and mixed cultivation, and that's the dominant. Incidentally, Colin Tyree, which some of you will think that's odd, Col is not the sort of island where you think of there being a high level of that's because Col and Tyree are one parish. It's where you get into an interesting problem. But basically, and notice, however, notice Orkney, and notice Butte, and notice indeed, though it doesn't come up very clearly, notice Skye. That's an indication of what I would call agricultural potential. But it isn't just how agriculture, the land, it's also how land was organized. And this, from some work I'm doing at the moment, shows the percentage of household heads who were crofters or other small agriculturalists, because they didn't all call themselves crofters, in 1881. And this is showing you the result, in a sense, of clearances. Isla down here, effectively really Mull, even to some extent Tyree, Orkney, because largely there, because of its larger scale farming, a typical agricultural unit, even the low-level ones there tended to be 20, 30, 40 acres. And similarly, fishing. You can't get fish everywhere. Fishing potential is really very variable in terms of fish stocks, and as we know, some of them go away. But it isn't just the fish stocks. It's also what you do with the fish when you've got it. And therefore, there's not much point in being able to catch fish if you can't actually get it to market, and that requires you to have a harbour or something within reasonable difference. And actually, again, not just the potential, but also how it's organised. And this is, I think, quite interesting. This actually shows the huge importance, this number of fishermen, the huge importance of fishing in Harris and Lewis in 1881, otherwise Shetland, otherwise Barra, otherwise Strath. Interestingly, 1881 is a very crucial year because if it had been 1891, there would have been a very substantial reduction, particularly in Barvas and Uig and Lochs, because the fishing failed. and the increasing size of boats and the fact that it wasn't local fishing anymore, it was essentially big fishing from those big ports on the Caithness coast and indeed around the Murray Firth. Right, some other sources of incomes. This is fairly straightforward. Natural endowments, quarries for marble and slate and things. Scenery, hugely exploited here. That's a natural endowment if ever there was one. Wildlife, which can also similarly be exploited. They're experts at this on Islay now. Economic activities, tourism, whiskey, surfing, see Tyree. Military activities, we'll come back from some examples of that in a minute. Lighthouses, manned lighthouses. As basis for commuting. Yes, we've talked really about this already. Some islands are significant basis for commuting. And administrative, professional, public services, big retail, holiday centres, they themselves can generate and support a huge amount of rural community. One of the fascinating things about Scotland now is, as a country as a whole, is that the rural population has been rising, mostly because people commute into the bigger towns. Not green, but that's how Inverness, for example, has grown substantially, and it's also the case, certainly, on Lewis. Drive back into Stornoway in the late afternoon, and the traffic will be pouring out into Lochs, into Barvas, in the other direction. And the size of the urban centres, I think, shocked me when I actually did this calculation. 72% of the population of Bute lives in Rothesay. 54% of the population of mainland Orkney in Kirkwall, and you can read the rest. Skye is interesting, because it's actually only 22%, and you may be able to explain that better than I can. Now for some actual population changes. Here we go. How has this diversity been reflected over time? Well, the larger islands, here we have them at the top. Harris and Lewis, that huge expansion of fishing, and also the huge investment by the Mathesons and Leverhulme, maligned people, but they were putting in huge amounts of money and supporting huge amounts of people, even if not exactly always where they would have wanted to live. But you get that huge expansion up to 1911, fishing collapses, and only a small recovery. Next one, Shetland mainland, that's oil. The next one, Orkney, there's a bit of oil there too, but there's something more in Orkney, which I can't at the moment explain. And here's Skye in dread decline right down to 1971, the orange line, and then recovery. Well, it's not the bridge, because it starts too early, but it actually must, to a considerable extent, I think, be tourism. Very different picture. This is the Uists and Barra and Benbecula. They expand up to 1871, and then, well, South Uist, the blue line, North Uist, the grey line, go down and are still in serious decline. Benbecula follows them, but then that's military installation, the airport and everything else. See, the different islands, they look the same, but you've got a completely different kind of population potential. And the orange one, that's Barra. Fishing, decline, and actually, recently, some recovery. The larger Argyll Islands, not much good story there, other than Mull. And Mull has actually been a great success as a tourist island and actually, we'll see in a minute, attracting in older people. I've got the figure somewhere, wait a minute, we'll come up to it in a minute. It's a huge proportion. Then, just to show you, well, Sanday, very sad. It's I think it's the prettiest of the Orkney Islands, but it's gone from 2,200-ish to about 500. Interestingly, South Ronaldsay looked very similar, but that has a causeway, and people now commute. And Unst, this flattening here, was the military installation, which subsequently went into decline. And by contrast, just to have some good news, Walsey, actually the only island that in 2011 had a larger population than it had ever had before. And that's because it has specialized in a fishing, specialist fishing facilities. And Burrow West, that actually is bridges. They built bridges between Burrow West and Burrow East and a little island called Trondra, and all their populations have gone up because, again, they're then connected to the rest of the island group. Okay. Oh, and finally, well, there's Bute. That's the holiday trade. And then people start not going from Glasgow to Bute for their holidays. They start getting on planes and going to the Mediterranean. And Bute has never recovered since. Arran has done better. Arran has fascinating geology and lots of other things. I think that's possibly tourism. And Great Cumbrae is actually, well, not been doing too well. And if indeed they triple the ferry prices or whatever they're going to do, that's not going to be very good either. So, how about the smaller islands? Well, we've talked quite a lot already about, I think, the smaller islands. There's St Kilda. We know about that one. Pabay, different Pabay. I thought we'd have to have a different Pabay. And that's the Pabay south of Barra. 26 people in 1881, 9 in 1911. Mingulay, they were some of the people who actually left from there and went, in fact, to Vatersay. And just to show that it isn't just in that period, that's Scarp, seen from Harris. Scarp, an interesting island, that's the landing stage. That's the one where they got so fed up with not being able to get their mail that they actually started trying firing it by rocket. It didn't work. So the question then, why are so many small islands inhabited for so long? Or indeed, some still are. Well, lighthouses are one. Land hunger following clearance from elsewhere. Shepherds with sheep. There are some islands that just have a shepherd and sheep. Close to fishing, close to bird cliffs. Conserving or observing nature. Gavin Maxwell in the little island under the bridge. A desire for privacy. That's him too. And living life one's own way. And I haven't talked about culture, but actually culture is very important in encouraging people to develop, particularly to stay, the culture of having access to land. But also, in Fula, Fula is a very traditional island where the men still have their meetings, like they did on St Kilda, and where they're still on the Julian calendar. Right, so why have some islands then declined? Well, you automate the lighthouses, kelp, local fisheries, the slate office, the slate business changed. Bilnahua had a population of 146 in 1871. Easdale had a population of 504 in 1871, the Slate Islands. Demographic imbalance, we've talked about that already today. Not enough women, because they have to are usually come in, and above all, a shortage of men to man the boats. Rising living standards, electricity, critical in that context. And then, well, we talked again, and we all know about unreliability of access to services, education, health came up this morning. And of course, simply the small technologies on the small islands can't compete in the market. Bigger boats. Nobody has a proper big-sized tractor nowadays on any of the smaller Scottish islands. But some survived, and there we are. And if the economies become diversified, moving beyond agrifish, what do you need? You need interesting tourist attractions, a long season. One of the problems that Tiree had was it only had a tourist season of about 2 months, plus accommodation. And of course, the prime example, with its influence also onto Mull, and it has Staffa as well. And finally, targeted immigration. Get in young families, but also get in the elderly. Bute did it. And Mull, I found the figure, 27% of the population of Mull was born in England in 2011. It's a really, 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 I think, significant figure. And finally, well, we know all about this, people determined to stay. So what happens? Well, actually, in this period, not much mass clearance. The young leave. Importantly, very, very, very few people come in, particularly to some of the islands. And And what you end up with is a highly skewed population pyramid. Cumbraes, 39% of the population of the Cumbraes over the age of 65. So, conclusion. Most islands have lost many, if not most, of their past strengths, the past reasons why people moved there. Only some managed to acquire new ones for their presence. The legacies of the past, therefore, have left us with islands, with populations that the infrastructure and the potentials don't really adequately support. Diversity will always rule. And thinking then about population policies, what is crucial is that we don't allow the Scottish Government to go on thinking about an island policy, unless their island policy is that it supports and recognises differences. And that's where we are.